you need to learn it. It's like, because part of how you regulate your interactions with other people is to negotiate. And you cannot negotiate unless you can say no. Can't do it. And it causes conflict to say no, and if you don't like conflict, which is basically the definition of being agreeable, then you can't tolerate the conflict, so then you can't negotiate on your own behalf, and so then you keep losing, and you're bullied, and it's not good. You get resentful, and it's really not good. So you have to develop your inner monster a little bit, and then that makes you a better person, not a worse person. It isn't so straightforward to determine what is in the world. And the thing that really got me with regards to that wasn't the good that we can do, but the harm that we can do. You can debate about the good we can do, but you cannot debate about the harm we can do. That's done. We know if we want to know. And I think my experience was when I took that seriously, understanding how that was about me, about the Auschwitz was about me, and the Stalinist camps were about me, then, well, that reorients you. That's a deep part of the shadow idea, right? And I think that is part of the idea of the world onto yourself. It's like you're a human being. So you see what human beings do. That's stupid. And you might say, well, I'd never do that. Like, don't be so sure about that. In fact, the probability that you're wrong is extraordinarily high. It isn't self-evident that the default position is heroism in the face of the advance. That's quite the contrary. So it's highly probable that you would be on the side of the weak transformed into oppressors. And that's a very terrifying realization if you take it seriously, which you should. And I do believe that if we don't take that with sufficient seriousness, we are not going to survive because we're too powerful to be naive. Something that you insisted on, especially after the invention of the hydrogen bomb in particular. If you're going to play with fire, you better be a master of fire.
What are the prerequisites for true knowledge and understanding? Because it seems to me that intelligence is only a small matter of seeing and understanding. It takes a certain amount of moral courage. It takes a certain amount of having done the work of introspection, having done the work of perception. What do you think the components are for true knowledge and understanding?
Well, I think the motivation, one of the best motivations, is existential terror. I mean, I don't remember where this is in the Old Testament, but the line is, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. That's definitely psychologically true, but we could strip it, say, of its transcendent implications and say, well, for me, anyways, I wasn't motivated to be serious until I knew what I was capable of in the most negative way. Because you don't take yourself seriously until you know that you are an evil monster. And you don't take that seriously until you know what that means. And so, but once you know what that means, especially if you find that out consciously, say, then you're in a position to start taking yourself seriously enough so that you might be willing to learn what you need to learn to become wise. You have to see yourself as an Auschwitz camp guard, and you have to see yourself enjoying it. And that can't just be an exercise in intellectual simulation, precisely. It has to be a dramatic experience. You have to feel that in your bones. And then you have to decide, and you have to give the devil his due. There's something very attractive about predatory power. And you might even say that it's preferable to pathetic weakness. Now, I'm not saying that, but you could make a case that it is. Because you could say that the person who's pathetically weak would like to be a predatory tyrant, but just doesn't have the ability. And that's a Nietzschean criticism of standard morality, I would say. But then, is there something higher than predatory power? Well, yes. Part of Christ's encounter with Satan in the desert is precisely that realization, because he's offered the kingdom of the world. And that means he's offered the option of tyrannical power. And his response to that is there's something better. And that's wisdom. There is something better. And there's no reason not to go for what is the best. Well, you don't have anything better to do than that by definition. So why not work for the betterment of being? Abandon your resentment, your hatred of humanity, and your self-contempt, and take on the responsibility of the horrors and catastrophes of human existence, and do what you can to, well, at least not make it worse, but maybe make it better. You know you can. You know you can make it worse and better. You just don't know how much. Find out. It might be way more than you think. I'm sure that's the case. So there isn't any more interesting adventure than that. You know, find out how much good you can do in the world, and not in this moralistic "thou shalt not" way, but in a forthright, noble, courageous, eyes wide open, articulate, embodied manner. And then God only knows where we could get it. So let's see. Let's find out. That would be good. It's certainly better than the alternative.
A painter, an architect.
And when European artists, writers, and theologians were shaping The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch has been interpreted in so many ways. I don't think that this is a painting of sexual freedom or of a medieval acid trip. This is not Bosch's erotic fantasy or even a heretical attack on the church. And this is not a painting by a member of an obscure free love cult. The Garden of Earthly Delights is pure and simply hardcore Christianity. This is a painting about sin. Garden of Earthly Delights consists of 3 oak panels hinged together so that the outer panels or wings can be closed. The center panel is 220 by 195 centimeters, and the side panels each are 220 by 97.5 centimeters. When the panels are closed, Bosch presents us with a very different image. Triptychs usually had one important biblical scene in the middle, with donors or saints either side. But in the Garden of Earthly Delights, all three panels are equally part of the story. At first glance, the painting is chaotic and overwhelming, but it has been meticulously planned. It has been said that the Garden of Earthly Delights ignores linear perspective, which had become the norm in Renaissance art. But I don't think so. If we look at the dead center of the panels, we find a hidden egg. It is the only unhatched egg on this panel, possible symbol of new beginnings. If we use this egg as the vanishing point, Bosch's composition has an order and the action emanates from the center of the panel. Then the three panels are linked by a common horizon line. They divide into three sections: foreground, midground, and background. The foreground contains the most important detail. Each panel in the midground contains a body of water, a small lake with a fountain, a pool with female bathers, and a frozen lake. The background consists of towers, organic in Eden and man-made in hell. And then in each panel, there is a central axis that your eyes are drawn to. Another way he anchors the three panels is by repetition. A good example is Adam, whose position is repeated in panel 2 as an E figure, and panel 3 in reverse. As we will see, all of these visual elements pull the Garden of Earthly Delights together and were planned in the early stages. Jan van Eyck didn't invent oil paints, but he did perfect them 100 years before Bosch. In my video on Van Eyck, I show how he depicted minute hyper-realistic detail by building up oil paint in translucent layers using a tiny brush. Van Eyck didn't leave the brushstrokes or any evidence of the human hand. Bosch differed from the Netherlandish painters of the time and used a fairly sketchy style along with the impasto technique, where paint is thickly applied and you can clearly see the brushstrokes in relief, which gives the surface texture. Bosch allows us to see the individual at work. The late Middle Ages were a pivotal moment in European history. Explorers were discovering new exotic lands. Da Vinci was painting the Mona Lisa. Copernicus proposed that the sun was at the center of our solar system, and Erasmus was exploring radical new ideas. The last bloody battles of the 100 Years' War had been fought, and now Christian Europe was facing an onslaught by the Ottoman Empire. It was the eve of the Reformation, and Europe was experiencing the first stirrings of a spiritual crisis, and yet it was also the height of the Spanish Inquisition. In Sertogenbosch in the Netherlands, a man called Hieronymus Bosch had no idea that a painting he was working on would still confound and confuse viewers 5 centuries after he painted it. We cannot look at Bosch's paintings with modern sensibilities, for while we may be comfortable with sex as a part of the human condition, in the Middle Ages, sex was seen as contributing to man's fall from grace. This was a time when European artists, writers, and theologians were shaping a new terrifying vision of hell and the punishment awaiting sinners. Bosch's imagery, no matter how bizarre, is nothing more than a faithful representation of the world in which he lived. It is an intensely moralistic work that should be approached as what it is: religious propaganda. As the 15th century turned into the 16th century, art got darker. The Garden of Earthly Delights is a compelling way to look back to a period that was no longer medieval, but not yet modern. It is often assumed that Hieronymus Bosch is a medieval artist, but he is a Renaissance artist, an exact contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci and influenced by the same ideas. Curiosity of thought, a hallmark of the Renaissance, fills his detailed and extremely precise paintings. Bosch was part of the Northern Renaissance, living and working in Sertogenbosch, commonly known as Den Bosch, in what is now the Netherlands. The Northern Renaissance artists were not nearly as well documented as the Italians. In fact, we know next to nothing about Bosch's life. History portrays him as a loner, but we know he was born to a family of artists in this house, and that he was hugely successful and prolific. His real name was Jerome van Aken, and he was born around 1450. Later, he would change his name to reflect Den Bosch, the town he lived in. He took Hieronymus for his first name, the Latin for Jerome. When he was a child, a major fire in Den Bosch burned the medieval city to the ground. As people panicked and screamed for their lives, he must have been affected, and it's not too much of a leap to think it inspired his vivid depictions of hellfire, which we see in many of his works. Den Bosch was a fiercely Catholic city with over 40 churches, chapels, and monasteries, and a spectacular Gothic cathedral. 1 in every 16 citizens worked for the church. Hieronymus Bosch was a member of a conservative Christian organization, the Illustrious Brotherhood of Our Blessed Lady, dedicated to the reverence of Mary, with their own chapel in St. John's Cathedral. He received several commissions from the Brotherhood, which was not just a religious organization, it was also a social network. Bosch married Alit van der Meeren, a wealthy older woman, around 1480. They had no children, and we know Bosch's funeral was in 1516. Records show us that Bosch's work originally filled the Brotherhood's chapel in St. John's Cathedral, and much of his inspiration would have come directly from the cathedral. As inventive as he was, his hybrid animals and monsters were from a well-established church tradition, exemplified by St. John's Cathedral. Bosch's creatures were certainly inspired by its Gothic gargoyles of curious figures, animals, and monsters. Elements of Gothic architecture inspired him as well, and in 1492, a baptismal font arrived in St. John that is not dissimilar in style to Bosch's strange architectural structures. As part of the Brotherhood's inner elite, he had easy access to the cathedral's archives and library. And another influence would have been the medieval manuscripts, where we find drollery or grotesques in the margins. These are small decorative images, which are often humorous or sexual in nature. Many of the images in the Garden of Earthly Delights can be traced back to the drolleries we see in manuscripts. Books of beasts or bestiaries were amongst the most popular illuminated texts in Northern Europe. A bestiary consists of both real and mythical animals. The main purpose of them was not to teach about the animal kingdom, but to teach people how to lead the life of a virtuous Christian. Artists would often get their inspiration from the journals of explorers. The first time most people saw a giraffe was in Cyriac of Ancona's Egyptian voyage. Bosch would draw from this book many times over the years, and other artists would also use it as a template. A busy artist like Bosch would have a bank of his own images that he would reuse, and we can see images repeated over several different works of his, again and again. What we think of as hell, and certainly what Bosch thought of as hell, is not based on the Bible. There is no mention of hell as a fiery place of eternal damnation in the original Bible. And much of what we think of as hell comes from later mistranslations and medieval art. What hell is like, or whether it exists in the Bible at all, is widely disputed, even within modern Christianity. Dante Alighieri's epic poem, The Divine Comedy from 1320, which describes Dante's journey through the 9 circles of hell, was hugely influential in European art. An earlier book, The Vision of Tundal, would be a major influence on Bosch. Based on the 12th century visions of an Irish knight, it was part of the medieval genre of visionary infernal literature that helped to define our ideas of hell. By the time Bosch painted the Garden of Earthly Delights, people firmly believed in heaven and hell. Satan became a major figure. Reports of encounters with demons increased. Heretics and witches were burned, and vivid descriptions of hell were reproduced in art. Often with paintings, we can look at the person who commissioned them to give us more insights into the work. In 1517, a year after Bosch died, we know for a fact that the Garden of Earthly Delights was in the Brussels palace of Henry III of the Nassau dynasty, the probable patron. The Netherlands at the time was ruled by Spain under King Philip the Handsome, but the local governors, such as Henry, came from the Nassau family. Henry was known as a cultured, educated, and inquisitive man, and he was transforming his residence into a magnificent Renaissance court. His art collection was central to that transformation. We know Henry visited Den Bosch with King Philip in 1504, and it was probably during this visit that he commissioned the Garden of Earthly Delights. Enigmatic paintings were fashionable in Europe at this time, and Henry would have understood the originality and intelligent thought involved in the painting. You would typically find triptychs in churches as altarpieces, where the outer panels were kept closed. On special occasions, such as holy days, the panels were opened, and the glorious religious scenes inside were revealed to the congregation. We can only imagine Henry inviting the crowned heads of Europe and their court to his palace to see his collection of objects of wonder, which included a meteorite, a giant bed, and this curious painting. The outer panels of the Garden of Earthly Delights could not prepare his guests for what lay within, leading them over to this rather dull image of the third day of creation. Two of his men would open the gloomy panels. People had never seen anything quite like this. It was a true sensation, like an early form of cinema that would occupy them for hours, like it does us. Art historian Reindard Falkenberg believes that the Garden of Earthly Delights was designed as a kind of conversation piece. As he points out, its characters are often pointing or whispering secrets to each other. They are inside the painting, reflecting us doing the same thing in front of the painting. It is a perfect reflection of the Renaissance taste for highly original, intricate allegories, full of meaning, only understood by a limited and elite audience. By opening the outer panels, you are opening up a world of metaphors and theological problems, starting with the garden itself. The central garden goes against the basic principle of the time, that artists should portray biblical stories that actually happened in the Bible. In the central panel, Bosch shows mankind giving into temptation, a scene anyone familiar with the Bible knows is not depicted. In Genesis, it was only Adam and Eve in the garden. The earth wasn't populated until after the expulsion, so this is a creation of Bosch's imagination. Just by fictionalizing or imagining a scene in the Bible, Bosch has freed himself to let his dreams run wild. This is new and exciting. As we can see, the figures are unashamed of their nudity, which reflects how Adam and Eve were before the expulsion. A lush garden would have strong sexual connotations to Bosch's contemporaries. They would have known about Western literature's most famous love garden at the time, described in the 13th century French poem Romance of the Rose. In the Garden of Earthly Delights, Bosch incorporated the same traditional iconography depicted in Romance of the Rose. Lush greenery, beautiful flowers, singing birds, and a fountain in the center, around which the lovers gather to stroll or sing. Water too was associated with love and lovemaking in Bosch's day. Even representations of the fountain of life frequently received an erotic twist. The concept of the Garden of Eden was changing around this period. It is important to remember that before the age of discovery, it was a widely held belief that the Garden of Eden still existed somewhere on Earth. But as the undiscovered world opened up, revealing fantastical beasts and landscapes, the feeling was that there was less and less chance of paradise existing here on Earth. It shifted the way people saw the world and perceived paradise, and greatly influenced Bosch's painting. By making his Garden of Earthly Delights a place of the imagination, Bosch was reflecting this shift in thinking. Bosch's images are so ambiguous and their meaning is so elusive that they cannot be addressed by iconography alone. When the outer panels are closed, it shows a monochrome painting of the creation of the world on a flat landscape enclosed in a transparent sphere, with God the Father looking down. God appears as a tiny luminous figure in the darkness. His hands are raised, which is medieval code to tell us he is speaking. He's reciting verse 9 of Psalm 33. For he spoke, and it was done. For he commanded, and it stood fast. If we look at a later verse from the same psalm, it explains the aerial perspective we see inside. The panels represent the third day of creation, when God is separating the land from the water, and the earthly paradise or Eden was created. These exterior doors are designed to act as a prologue to the interior. The use of monochrome, or what is known as grisaille, for the outer panels of a triptych was quite conventional and is there to set the stage for the explosion of colour within. There is some vegetation forming and strange hybrid landscapes which connect with what we'll see inside, but man has not yet been created and so not had a chance to abuse God's earth, the theme of the inner panels. The Nuremberg Chronicle, published in 1493, was an important source of inspiration for Bosch, and one we will come back to. The first of its more than 1,800 illustrations shows God the Father, crowned and enthroned, holding an orb with his left hand and making a sign of benediction with his right. He also quotes Psalm 33. The dome is peculiar to modern eyes. In researching this video, I used a translation of the Vulgate Bible, the first official Bible of the Catholic Church, and the one Bosch would have used. The meaning can often vary from translation to translation. On day 2 in Genesis, the Vulgate translated the Hebrew as God created the sky under a dome. This is sometimes translated as firmament from the word firm or solid. There was theological disagreement, but Bosch would have been well aware of this idea that the world was created in a solid dome, and it was a standard artistic convention. Around this time, science made more discoveries about the Earth, and a solid dome became a big theological problem. By the time Galileo began examining the sky, 100 years after the Garden of Earthly Delights, the concept of a solid dome was no longer a common belief. This, of course, met with opposition from within the Catholic Church and accusations of heresy. This panel is sometimes known as the joining of Adam and Eve, and shows a scene in the Garden of Eden when God presents Eve to Adam. God's right hand is raised in blessing, while he holds Eve's wrist with his left. It is an uncommon scene in art. God is very Christ-like and has blonde hair and blue eyes. It is likely that this image was used to illustrate the belief that Jesus is God in human form, God incarnate. We know from infrared scans and analysis that Bosch originally intended God to be more traditionally portrayed, and he was looking down at Adam. The original plan was a more classic image we have seen many times, that of God creating Eve from Adam's rib. But Bosch changed it to the moment when God blesses their union and urges them to procreate. He is saying, be fruitful and multiply. By changing this panel from one of the creation of Eve to one that is associated with marriage, it changes the entire reading of the triptych, that marriage and reproduction are inextricably linked. But the theological questions raised here is the role of sexual activity and lust in Eden. Adam, who has just woken up, is smiling and wide-eyed at the sight of Eve. His cheeks are flushed. Eve is looking down innocently, while at the same time seductively presenting her body to Adam. God as Christ is looking directly at us, so we too are complicit in what is to come. Eve is on the left of God, and he is holding her with his left hand. Left is sinistra in Latin, or sinister. Adam, however, is to God's right, the place of honor in religious art. Below Eve's feet are rabbits, who for obvious reasons symbolize fertility. Besides Adam, a tomcat has captured its prey. As anachronistic as it is to us, to the medieval viewer, having a Christ as God in the Garden of Eden was common and would be seen as an omen of the crucifixion, a direct result of original sin. The point is emphasized further by the position of Adam's feet, which echo Christ on the cross. Over Christ's shoulder is the tree of life. It is a dragon blood tree, which when cut releases a dark red pulp, giving it its name. The flat leaves of the tree resemble the wafers of Eucharist, and the grapes reference the wine, giving us a direct link to the body and blood of Christ. The vaguely crucifix form of the tree may be the medieval belief that Jesus was crucified on a cross linked to the tree of life. Bosch would not have known the dragon blood species, found only in tropical climates. Once again, the Nuremberg Chronicle is his source. In this image of the Garden of Eden, we find all three trees in Bosch's painting: the dragon blood tree, the tree of knowledge, and the date palm, symbolic of resurrection, which Bosch paints with the serpent waiting to strike. Earthly paradise looks peaceful at first glance, but it already holds the dark promise of sin. The pool below is already starting to be populated by strange creatures. The three-headed bird perhaps points to the Trinity. A unicorn representing purity drinks from the pond on the left, accompanied by a boar, a goat, a horse, a deer, and a bull. These animals are going to reappear in the second panel. The fountain of paradise is a direct link to God by being on the same vertical axis and being the same color as his robes. It is a Christian symbol associated with baptism and the Eucharist. It serves as a symbol of life, fertility, and reproduction. Sitting inside it, we find the owl, which is a kind of signature for Bosch. The Garden of Earthly Delights has 6 owls. One owl, barely visible, is looking down over the entire scene. The 6th owl will appear later as the Prince of Hell. Contrary to its modern association with wisdom or intelligence, for many people in the Middle Ages, the owl, as a nocturnal animal looking for prey, represented the devil himself, waiting for an opportunity to strike. In Bosch's world, evil exists, even in the Garden of Eden. Just to the right of the fountain is a small swan, a symbol of purity and grace, but here I think a nod to the illustrious brotherhood of the Virgin Mary, who were also called the Swans' Fraternity, as they serve swan at their banquets. Continuing the theme of hidden dangers in the Garden of Eden, there are a group of repulsive reptilian amphibious creatures coming ashore. Many of Bosch's paintings feature toads, which were considered both poisonous and demonic in the Middle Ages. And in hell, they will take on the role of the devil's henchmen. An unusual rock formation is in the form of a weeping face. This is Golgotha, or Skull Hill. It is based on a widespread belief in the Middle Ages that Adam's skull was buried in a cave, as seen here, underneath the spot where Jesus would be crucified. 400 years after Bosch painted the Garden of Earthly Delights, it will inspire the Surrealist movement, and in particular, Salvador Dali. Hieronymus Bosch is often seen as a precursor to the Surrealists, who called Bosch the first modern artist. Unlike the Surrealists, we cannot view Bosch's visions as images from his subconscious. As far as Bosch was concerned, his images were a realistic portrayal of sin and its consequences. So in that sense, it wasn't surrealism, it was realism. This panel is a carnal interpretation and direct corruption of God's words, "Be fruitful and multiply." In the Vulgate Bible, the Garden of Eden is referred to as Paradisum voluptatis. It might not be the best translation of the Hebrew, but it is extraordinary. To Bosch, Eden would have been known as the paradise of pleasure. Explanations like these are not just for art history. Bosch himself, as part of the religious orthodoxy, needed to be able to explain the theology of his paintings. Everything in this paradise of pleasure has some kind of sexual connotation. Hollowed out fruit is referring to female genitalia. 2 cherries together, male genitalia. In the Middle Ages, to pluck fruit in Dutch, was a euphemism for sex, and the Dutch word vogelen, meaning bird, was a double entendre for sexual intercourse. All of these pleasures are transient, as none of Earth's pleasures will last. This fountain is a version of the previous one. It is surrounded by 4 towers covered in thorns and spikes, and 4 rivers reflecting the biblical location of Eden. But this fountain is broken and fragile, as are the delights being enjoyed in the garden. Despite the many naked figures and suggestions of lust in the image, there are no sexual acts explicitly portrayed, except for this scene. Inside the dark hole in the central sphere of the fountain, a bearded man shamelessly touches the crotch of a naked young woman as others watch. The owl has gone and lust has found its way. Follow your eyes up and we see the crescent moon, a fairly explicit reference to the Ottoman Empire and Islam, the enemies of Christianity in the Middle Ages. We have seen it many times in other works by Bosch, and we will see it again in Hell. But we have to go to the bottom right-hand corner to find the main message. It is, of course, debated, but I think this is Adam and Eve, who are now fully aware of the existence of good and evil, a concept that didn't exist before the fall of man, according to the Bible. Adam is looking directly at us, as if he's the only one to understand what's going on, pointing at Eve as if to say, she's to blame. Eve is holding the fruit she has just picked, and she is gagged by what looks like a communion wafer. This is theologically controversial, and I think it refers to chapter 2 in Timothy, one of the most debated verses in the Bible. Adam and Eve, now aware of shame, are the only ones wearing clothes in the panel, animal skins, which ties into the biblical story. Over Adam's shoulder, it is hard to make out, but the man behind him has vine leaves on his head. This is pre-flood, and I think this is Noah, there to remind us that Eve's sin will lead to the flood. Noah, as the originator of vineyard cultivation, often is depicted with vine leaves. Eve is encased within a semi-cylindrical transparent shield. We see these glass contraptions throughout the painting, and they are the only man-made objects in this panel. These instruments were associated with alchemists, who were common in the Middle Ages, but were seen as heretics, meddling with forbidden knowledge. This woman's body is entirely covered in glistening golden hair, except for her face, hands, and feet, and notably her breasts. She and other figures like her in the painting are wild men and women, uncivilized savages, popular subjects in the age of discovery. In and around the strange orange tent, you can only see men, some of whom are turning their buttocks towards each other, a clear reference to homosexuality that no one in the Middle Ages would have missed. Sodomy, like all non-reproductive sexual acts, are seen as a sin. One of the men is holding a fish. Like all of the fish in this panel, it is out of its element, and there to remind us that the world order is in chaos. In this corner, a group of men are having a conversation while pointing to Adam and Eve in the previous frame. It is as if they are saying, this is where it all started. Exactly what Henry III's court might be saying. The empty mussel shell should be seen like all of the empty metaphors Bosch employs. The peeled fruit, the broken egg, the carcasses. Emptiness is lack of spirituality, which leads to sin. Pearls are perfectly round and pure white, so often represent purity and virginity. And the fact that the pearls are falling out of the mussel shell tell us exactly what the couple are up to inside. It is this type of scene within a scene and visual conundrums that make me believe the theory that it was designed as a conversation piece. Although the message overall is cautionary, the piece is highly entertaining. There is a particular focus on the devouring of grotesquely huge and fleshy fruit. All the fruits featured are soft fruits, whose taste and fragrance are fragile and transient. Blackberries have multiple seeds and so stand in for promiscuity. Fruit, of course, has a sexual connotation, thanks to Eve, although the Bible doesn't specifically say which fruit Eve ate. And anyway, it wasn't lust that Eve succumbed to, but temptation. A common belief in the Middle Ages was that after Eve gave in to temptation and after the fall, Eve's next sin was carnal lust. It's not scriptures, just early misogyny. It's a common misconception, but even today, the viewer mixes up temptation and lust. Here we see a transparent sphere. It contains a man and a woman, umbilically attached to a large flower. This could be a Boschian variation on the Mayboats depicted in late medieval books with courting couples. Cracks are appearing in the glass, suggesting that pleasure is as fragile as glass. Keeping watch is another owl who has taken a human lover. Bosch's work shows a lot of interracial lovemaking. In medieval Europe, Moors came to mean anyone who was Muslim or who had dark skin. Views of Africans in Europe were often negative, and like the wild men in the Garden of Earthly Delights, they were seen as uncivilized sexual beings. The middle of this panel is dominated by the circuit of men on all kind of mounts, corralling a group of women. In this dance, the unicorn and other animals we saw drinking peacefully in the first panel have been corrupted and now serve as mounts in the circular procession of lust. Many of the scenes in the Garden of Earthly Delights can be traced back to the court games of the aristocracy. The circuit references medieval fertility rituals, Morris dances with several men dancing around a single woman or around the May tree. This parade is something the court of Henry III would have understood. The 14th century book Lumen Anime by Matthias Farinator was hugely influential in the Netherlands. Bosch had a preoccupation with the deadly sins, and in this widely read book, Farinator portrayed the deadly sins as riding animals. Pride rode a dromedary, lust a bear, wrath a camel, sloth a leopard, and gluttony a wildcat. The object of their lust, Bosch's bathing women, were probable nods to the 16th century Dutch expression, swim in the bath of Venus, which meant being in love. The women, as classical representations of Venus, have a negative pagan connotation. Even here, the Venus are involved in a deep conversation. Previous scenes are set in nature, but hell is a man-made world. There is nothing here that they have not brought on themselves, and even the musical instruments they created have turned on them. The demons are clothed, but the humans, or souls, are still naked. But they have lost any element of eroticism, and many of them are covering their bodies, ashamed of their nakedness. What is so extraordinary is that the strange creatures in this panel are painted with the same conviction and realism as the humans, as though they actually existed. In the bottom right, we find this curious scene, which for me is the beginning of the panel. A pig dressed as a nun is trying to persuade a soul to sign a document. A helmeted demon offers a quill, and he has the ink at the ready for him to sign. The red seals show us this is a serious legal document. For many historians, this is seen as a critique of the church by Bosch, specifically the sale of indulgences. I don't think it is. The wealthy could buy an indulgence from the church to have their sins forgiven and secure a place in heaven. It led to widespread corruption, and only 1 year after Hieronymus Bosch's death, Martin Luther published his attack on, amongst other things, the sale of indulgences, leading to the Reformation. In the late 13th century, work started on a Gothic cathedral in Den Bosch, and there is strong evidence that the church raised most of the funds required by selling these indulgences. The illustrious Brotherhood of Our Blessed Lady played a key role in the indulgence industry, so Bosch, as a member of the inner elite, was hardly likely to be critical of it. I think this man has been tricked into signing a pact with the devil by the demon disguised as a nun. A major preoccupation in the Middle Ages was the selling of one's soul in exchange for diabolical favors. It looks like the man is onto them, as he is casting anxious looks at us, the viewer, as if pleading for help. The toad on the notary's lapel, a sign of the devil's henchman we saw in the left panel, will appear again and again in hell. The helmeted demon offering the pen to sign has a foot hanging off his helmet, which could refer to an affliction caused by fungus inbred called ergot. Victims suffered from burning sensations and hallucinations of being attacked by monsters. Limbs would rot and fall off. In Bosch's time, they thought this condition was caused by possession by demons. In the 1950s, a component from ergot was synthesized to produce the psychedelic drug we know today as LSD. This would inevitably lead to supposition that Bosch painted the Garden of Earthly Delights while he was tripping. As we've seen, the sin of lust was thought to give rise to other deadly vices. And once again, Bosch looks to the 7 deadly sins. The deadly sins, again, are not scripture, but were described by Pope Gregory in the 6th century. By the time of Bosch, they were a popular theme in morality plays and hugely influential in art. Lust and envy are everywhere throughout the panel. Elsewhere we find a greedy miser who's forced to excrete gold coins into a cesspool. The glutton is forced to vomit up his food. The slothful man is visited in his bed by a demonic toad. And the vain woman is doomed to stare for eternity at her own reflection, which we can make out in a demon's backside. She is being grabbed from behind by another demon, while a toad sits on her chest. She closes her eyes to avoid her reflection and the horror around her. I think her resemblance to Eve is undeniable. In the previous panel, birds fed humans. Here, they eat them. The owl again makes his appearance, this time as the Prince of Hell. With a cauldron for a crown and jugs for shoes, it is sitting on a giant potty chair. Human bodies are being consumed and excreted simultaneously, to go straight into the sewer where others are already drowning in filth. In Bosch's day, the river running through the heart of Den Bosch was an open sewer. Its stench was everywhere in the city. We can get an insight into Bosch's working practice if we look at the infrared scan of this area. We can see that originally Bosch sketched an enormous toad here, hanging over the Prince of Hell. Another, perhaps better world is suggested in the reflection in the Prince of Hell's crown. Behind the Prince of Hell, the crescent moon on the head of a religious woman makes a reappearance. The severed hand holding a dice is another repeated image. It references the word of God we saw in the first panel, only now it has been corrupted and is balancing a dice as man plays with God's word. The overturned table is a likely reference to Christ and the moneylenders. One gambler is nailed to the table. By the right hand he rolled the dice he lost his fortune on. On the corner of the table, a tally of souls is being kept. This man is blindfolded and represents moral or spiritual blindness. There is a difference between being blindfolded and being blind, as it suggests that the figure had the capability of seeing the light but refused. The medieval figure synagogue was a common symbolic representation of spiritually blind Jews. Gambling leads to lust and more sin, and the naked woman with her eyes lowered is holding a candlestick and beer pitcher, identifying her as a prostitute. In the Netherlands, prostitutes use candles to entice passers-by, a medieval precursor to the red light district. The dice on her head is the dice of a cheat, as the opposite sides cannot add up to 7. The man covering his eyes is bent over, a pose that connects the scene. In this case, their hunched backs reference homo incurvatus in se, a theological phrase describing a life lived inward for oneself, rather than outward for God and others. Besides them, a hare carries his bleeding victim on a pole as he sounds his horn. He has a pair of hounds who have caught another victim. Maybe they were poachers. Hare coursing was illegal for the lower classes. The hunted becomes hunter expresses the chaos of hell, where the normal relationships of the world are turned upside down. Non-religious music was considered sinful, associating it with other sins of the flesh and spirit. Musical instruments often carried erotic connotations in works of art of the period. A cacophonous choir is forced to sing by a demonic choir master, whose tongue is like a scale of notes. The music is written on a victim's buttocks, who is crushed by a giant lute. Some characters cover their ears as best they can to try to avoid the horrendous noise. Others are crushed, locked, or impaled by the instruments. A man has been tied to the neck of a giant lute and is about to be set on by a snake-like monster. A crucifixion is an unusual scene for hell, but here we have a figure crucified on the strings of an enormous harp. To emphasize the crucifixion, a roasted toad is offered up to him in a parody of the sponge of wine offering to Christ when he was crucified. A demon beats a drum, while inside a man is trapped crying out in fear. Another man has a recorder jammed up his bottom, while he is bearing the weight of a giant flute, echoing Christ carrying the cross. It is as if hell is mocking Christianity. On top of the hurdy-gurdy is a blind beggar. One more turn of the handle and the lady playing the triangle will lose her head. The hurdy-gurdy was associated with beggars who were often blind, here a stand-in for spiritual blindness. He is holding a begging bowl in his other hand. Bosch gives us the minute detail we associate with the Northern Renaissance artists, and we see a metal badge on a ribbon hanging off the bowl, which is a license to beg granted by nobles like Henry III. Beside him, another man balancing an egg is hunched up, holding a walking cane, another Homo incavatus in se. The trumpeter wears the Ottoman flag and heralds Satan, who fell from heaven as a star. The most famous creation in hell is the tree man, a perfect Boschian mix of realism, metaphor, and fantasy. We have seen this figure before in an earlier drawing by Bosch, except in the original we have a Turkish flag flying out of his backside. The face is almost certainly a self-portrait of Bosch. His look is strangely self-conscious and stylistically out of keeping with the other depictions of human faces. He could be there as a warning against vanity. His torso is a broken egg, which doubles as a tavern in his backside. His head is topped with bagpipes, another instrument for the infernal orchestra. Bagpipes were a symbol of lust, as they resemble a scrotum and penis. Strange couples of mixed species circle the bagpipe, a reference to the circuit of lust on the previous panel. Taverns are places where men and women are lured into sin. One man is sitting on an evil toad. Above them, the Turkish flag from the drawing is now a bagpipe flag, reminding us that the partaking of alcohol leads to sin. The tree man is balanced on two small boats with legs of decaying branches. The boats, or skiffs, suggest he is ferrying souls across the river. It is made clearer in his original drawing. This puts the painting more along the lines of a Last Judgment. Bosch's own painting of that subject follows a similar structure to the Garden of Earthly Delights. The world burns in the background as souls are being sent across the river to be judged in the foreground. And both paintings use similar iconography. On one of his legs, a slipped bandage reveals a leper sore. I don't think anything in this painting is without meaning, and that we are seeing anti-Jewish sentiment here. A possible interpretation of this is that he represents the Antichrist, as Bosch has previously painted this sore on the leg of a figure in this painting, identified as the Jewish Antichrist. It was a common belief, but not in the scriptures, that the Antichrist would be covered in leper sores and that he will be of Jewish origin. Below him, hell is literally frozen over. A man balancing on a giant ice skate will soon collide with another in the ice water. A demon, bow and arrows at the ready, but strangely with no arms to fire them, is giving chase to the human figures. The horse skull is like all skulls in paintings. It is a memento mori to remind us that one day we will die. The message is clear. Life is short, but eternity would last forever. Below the skull, a demon gleefully rings the bell, whose clappers have been replaced by a naked man. Out of the skull's eye, a devil is reeling in a key. The key has always puzzled me, as we are so used to seeing keys as representing the keys to heaven. A medieval interpretation was that God gave Satan the keys to the bottomless pit, and this is where that comes from. Theologically, it is ambiguous, but aesthetically it makes sense, as immediately above it, new souls are ushered into hell. The key is there to remind us that the gates of hell have been opened. The lamp here is extremely prominent. I think this section is reserved for the soldiers that arrested Christ holding lanterns and carrying weapons. They are being burned alive in the lantern as punishment. The leader, whose flag bears the devil's toad, holds a chalice, while next to it we see a wafer, a clear reference to the body and blood of Christ. He is being eaten alive on a large disc, which in turn resembles the one in the first panel. The soldiers are being skewered by demons. The character in white with the stereotypical big nose is behind them climbing a ladder and could be Judas about to hang himself. The ominous-looking ears are a war machine, crushing people in its wake. Like the blind metaphors throughout hell, the knife cutting through the ears would reference deafness to the word of God. But the similarity to the male sexual organ is also unmistakable. The knife holds a symbol that looks like a letter M or B, which has confused historians for centuries. The truth is pretty mundane. Den Bosch was known throughout Europe for its manufacture of knives, and in the 1990s, archaeologists found a knife dated to the 15th century, which has the same shape and mark used here by Bosch. Even ordinary household implements are turning on us. Cities in Europe were tinderboxes, and fires were common. This is the climax of the painting, a realistic portrayal of a city on fire that may well have been based on Bosch's childhood memories. A hostile army is seizing the city, led by a horned demon. We see people trying to escape the fire using ladders or jumping into the dirty waters of the canal to certain death. Crowds of people are being pushed down to the riverbank to be transported across the icy river to be judged and punished. This is a hell that the medieval mind would have understood on so many levels. Death was all around them. Finally, a tiny detail at the apex of the volcano. We can just make out two figures fighting, one a demon in black and one a human in white. This is the fight that Bosch's contemporaries would have seen as a lifelong battle, the fight between good and evil. Bosch's inclusion in Henry III's collection would have boosted his reputation, and his infamy spread throughout Europe. We know the painting was popular as so many copies of it were commissioned, some in Bosch's lifetime and some even by his own workshop. Paintings were an expensive investment, so it must have been extremely well known and copied so much. There were also tapestries made of it after Bosch's death. Henry III died in 1538, and the painting was inherited by his nephew William, who was a Protestant reformer and therefore an enemy of the state. His property was confiscated by the Catholic Duke of Alba, who brought the Garden of Earthly Delights to Spain. It was soon sold to King Philip II, a keen collector of Bosch, known as El Bosco in Spain. Philip owned many of Bosch's paintings, and it is the reason why Spain has such a large collection. Philip was a staunch Catholic, defender of the faith, and a leading figure of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. He also used a ruthless Spanish Inquisition in order to keep his subjects in line and root out heretical thought. It is difficult as modern viewers to look at this painting and not see it as surrealism or a product of the subconscious, not see it as a sexual utopia, a critique of religion, or even a psychedelic romp. It is why so many bizarre theories have emerged. But whatever its true meaning is, and we'll never know, just by virtue of being in the royal collection of the deeply conservative Philip II, it is clear that the Garden of Earthly Delights was a reflection of the religious thinking of the day. Philip kept it in the Escorial, the monastery that doubled as his royal residence, where it was known as El Modroño, or the Strawberry. It stayed at Escorial for over 300 years until it was moved to the Prado Museum in 1939, along with other works by Bosch. This film is only one approach to the painting. it is difficult to ascribe meaning to all the specific elements. However, I decided to take the approach that viewers in Henry III's court might have, to treat it as an intellectual puzzle with a moralistic streak, a painting that is there to create a conversation. If you have theories or ideas, I'd love to hear about them in the comments.
Okay. Understand.